Hello, Susan Corbett, Custom Machine Quilter here. Today I'm going to talk about quilting this really traditional quilt called Oak Alley. The goal here was to quilt it quickly to hold down the price. Now it's traditional, and once I got it on the frame, I could see very easily that we had a wavy border here to deal with. It's not bad, and I've encountered this issue numerous times. So first let's get that part out of the way. Pinning substitutes as a form of stabilizing until I can get in there and do some quilting. So I use a ruler a lot to make sure everything is straight, horizontally and vertically. And as you can see here, I'm kind of lightly pulling on the very top of that as a way to ease in some of the fullness. Not in a severe way, just slightly. And the great thing is that at a certain point down the road, once it's quilted, you aren't going to be able to tell there was ever any kind of a problem at all. So see here, I'm pinning each section little by little by little. And I used about 3 different thread colors in this quilt, and I was constantly changing back and forth just because I like to stabilize before I do anything else, most of the time, by far. And if I got going with one color or thread, I'd have to stop and change to another to get the next component sewn down. So here, throughout the quilt, I heard years ago that when people are trying to do a custom quilt really quickly to hold the price down, they would just leave off the ditch quilting. And that's not something I'm willing to do. I think that's a huge mistake. And here, just to keep it all nice and flat and straight, it was a crucial thing to do. So how to keep a wavy border from happening in the first place? As you can see, there's lots of borders on this quilt. And the first one, that dark, that black border, is up against triangular pieces of fabric. And I quizzed the client about how she had cut out those pieces. One of the things to watch out for is, with any triangle, you've got to think about where the bias edge is going to go. So make sure the bias edge is not up against that black border, because that's when you're asking for trouble. I mean, it's all a little tricky there, and I have found that a lot of people don't know about the grain of the fabric. If you didn't come from a garment sewing background, you might not know about the grain line. The fabric has a straight grain, a crosswise grain, and the bias. The straight grain does not stretch. The crosswise grain stretches, and the bias really stretches a whole lot. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I think the main thing is put one border on based on the measurement of the body of the quilt. Years ago, I had a client who said, but I cut my pieces, I followed the pattern directions exactly. But that's theoretical. What the pattern says your pieces need to look like, that's one thing, but what they really are in practice is another. So measure each Like whenever you put another border on, you've got a whole new measurement for the quilt. So measure each side and cut your next border to fit. And that's a good way to get out of having a wavy border problem. And sometimes, you just will anyway, because it's just a real easy thing to do. Starching your fabric before you cut it would be a really good idea. I've had clients who have starched their fabric after they've pieced it together. That doesn't do any good. What that gets me is a quilt that I can't get back into square. So this is not the fun part of making a quilt, but it's a very crucial part. It'll be well worth all this trouble in the end. So since this is a tree quilt, thematically, we're going after organic elements. So that means leaves, vines, and the fastest thing I can think of to get around a quilt efficiently is continuous curves. So there will be a whole lot of those in here. So here I'm ditch quilting around those big triangles in this border. For triangles that big, I would say they're crucial. I did not know how I was going to quilt that border otherwise, so I felt pretty confident about doing this. In the end, I just ended up doing continuous curve here too. And so the ditch quilting here turned out not to be necessary. I think it's nice, but that's where that could have been left off. All right, so I'm ditch quilting around the triangles. I also did ditch quilting between the light colored triangles and the outer border. It looks like there's two separate borders between the print and that narrow black border that's up against it, but that's just one piece of fabric. So I would go back in there with the proper thread color and quilt lines around that narrow black border. And then to quilt that frame itself, which I believe is crucial, I just quilted a wave, following the lines in the print. Very simple. And here's what the side looks like. And here's a look at how I manage the fullness on the sides. Now my plan for quilting that border was to outline the print, and I could have done that up on top, but I'm not comfortable doing that until the whole quilt is stabilized, because I don't want to have to go back in there and rip out stitches because I was too overeager to get it done. I want to make sure the whole thing squares up before I go back and do any visible quilting that's not ditch quilting. See all those ripples in there? Those are going to disappear when they're quilted. So see the difference between the fullness on the outer border and how little fullness there is to manage between the cream border and the triangle border. So after I stabilized everything, the first thing I did was go back and quilt the outer border, because the more quilting there is in a quilt, the more the empty spaces we can worsen the problem of the fullness in the fabric, and I want to get that nailed down as soon as possible. So that was job number one. And this is a large quilt. It's 80 by 80. So I know it looks like in this clip that I've quilted other things, but this was probably the last pass I made on this outer border. Most of it, and especially the really full parts, were quilted down. As I say, I changed thread back and forth, and so I skipped around quite a bit. So I'm not quilting every last little teeny detail, because there's a whole lot of them. I'm just nailing down most of it. And see, around these spindly little detailed parts, I'm just quilting around the whole component, not every little tiny circle and line. Whereas most of the quilting on this quilt went pretty quickly, this part, outlining the fabric does not go quickly. This is time consuming. But that was the one area that I actually took some time to quilt. I just thought that would be the best thing. The client really loves her quilt, and she'd spent years making it. And she has a real eye for bordered prints. So we want that print to look just as gorgeous as it is. So there's a lot of quilting, I guess you could say, but it's not for the sake of showing the quilting off, it's for the sake of showing the print off. So I'm doing one side as far as I can go, and then doing the other side. Looking for the most continuous path, which changed a few times. I've chosen a thread that matches the background color of that print, so it's not going to call attention to itself. I don't want to outline with a contrasting thread. So we're getting closer right now to that red and cream flower. Now at first I thought, well, I'll just go around it and, keep the quilting really minimal. And then later I decided, no, that there really does need to be more quilting inside that flower. It just looked too empty. So I changed the game plan up a little bit. So on pass 2, I'd go back in there and add some more quilting to that big flower. Here's a look at that unquilted flower. See, I just think it needs more. So I put just a little bit more, and that was good. And you can see where that, where the line around that frame needs some quilting, or it was rippling. So that made a big difference. And here we're doing ditch quilting around the tree block itself. So ditch quilting and then continuous curve only in the background triangles in the tree leaves themselves. I decided to leave in this case, in this block, the black fabric unquilted, just up in the leaves. So I tried to find a way to make this line of stitching as continuous as possible, to make it go quickly, just in one pass. And the backgrounds were of different fabrics, so that necessitated another thread color change. So there was some back and forth happening here. And at this point, I don't know how I'm going to quilt the tree trunk. But as usual, when I'm stabilizing, ideas pop into my mind. So here, I'm quilting the background of the tree leaves, looking for a fluid, continuous path. And this went pretty quickly, mostly. This is fun and satisfying to quilt. So I'm thinking round and then stop at the point. Round, stop at the point. My machine does not like quilting from right to left, so I try and cooperate with it, and that's why I changed up the order here on this top part a little bit. I can more successfully quilt those big deep curves from right to left than I can the more straight line looking lines. Okay, so it came to me, let's just do some more continuous curve. And in that big part, I'm doing double continuous curve. It's a fast way to get around it. It looks really good. It's graceful, it's pretty. It softens up all these angles and points and corners. Since I started in the middle, I want to cut those thread tails off as soon as possible, or they'll just create problems. So that was quick. And it looks really pretty. Now on to the sashing. I changed thread color here. And there's certain things I can just quilt in my sleeve, and a vine of simple leaves and little tendrils and, you know, some big fat leaves and some narrow leaves. That goes really quickly. I did continuous curve in the star of the cornerstones, and this is where I was rethinking, should I stitch quilt around them? And I ended up deciding yes, because they looked to me like they needed it. Here's another view. So with leaves, you can quilt the vein first and then the outer shape, or you can quilt the outer shape and then the vein. So for this leaf, I like to do the outer edge first and then go back in and vein it up. So see the difference between that block without the ditch quilting and the block with. I think it just looks a lot more tailored, more graceful. Without the ditch quilting, I just think that would have looked awful. And on some of the sashing parts, like I had the vines emanating from the cornerstones, and then along the sides, I did things a little bit differently. I wanted them all to go up, since this is a directional quilt. So I changed the direction some. And then on some of the sashings where they were not emanating from a center star, I started with a little swirl and ended up with some little tendrils, which is fun to do, and they look really good. Now I'm quilting another border, and I decided the fastest thing I could do here is a big meander. I don't like big meanders as an overall design or as a background, but I love it in a frame, in a narrow border. It's super fast. It's graceful, it looks good, and the only trick to it is you want to change directions in the middle, which is what happened at the beginning of this clip. And that's an easy change to manage. So it changes directions in the middle, and then the corners just naturally fall into place. And you'll be able to see here. See how it just, there's not one thing to worry about there. It's over in no time, and it's good looking. Okay, now I've got decisions to make. What's going to happen in the remaining borders? So here I decided let's just go with continuous curve. And what I want to show at this point is, well, I thought I can continuous curve the dark triangles and then maybe do something else in the light ones. And that's not what ended up happening. I thought, I'm still, expending a lot of effort for not that much payoff, and let's just get it over with. Let's put all the focus on the body of the quilt and not so much on these outer borders. So the direction of the triangles changes in the middle, and that I use that opportunity to test out some theories here. So here we are freehanding those triangles, and I thought it's easier to make a mistake when freehanding larger triangles, and maybe I should use a ruler to make them as perfect as possible. But look how much it slows the process down. And really, I looked back at the at the ones I had freehanded, and they looked just fine. So if you're doing a show quilt where you need all kinds of accuracy, a ruler would be a great way to get around, but look how much faster the freehanding is. So I think it pays to get really comfortable with freehanding. And you can zoom around the quilt in a lot of ways. And now onto the blackboard. What's another super fast way to get this quilted? Feathers. There aren't any feathers anywhere else on this quilt, and I thought this would be a good place to put them. Notice I've started with the corner because they're going to change directions as well. So they'll start at the corner and meet in the middle. This is an open feather. There's no stem in the middle. And there's no crossing over, there's no backtracking. Well, there's very little. Because I'm using a contrasting thread, I don't want there to be a lot of buildup in the middle of the feather, where I've laid in a lot of color, compared with only one line of color on the outer edge of the feather. So I like the open feather for that purpose. And then you have to think about what's going to happen in the middle. So I'm referring to a pattern pack I bought years ago, but I'm not using the pattern itself because I'm a freehander. So I've sort of done what the pattern maker suggested. It doesn't look exactly the same, but it looks fine. So the design appears to meet up in the middle, even though I didn't stop in the middle and change directions. And then you go back to the corner and go up in the other direction. So we're really getting down to it now. This is what I did with the setting triangles. We've opted for large oak leaves. And you see how detailed the print of this fabric is. So we auditioned, I don't know how many threads, and ended up with this dark brown. And after the whole thing was done, I thought, well, I don't know if I really love that. And maybe a better idea would have been to do some kind of straight line design in these triangles. Because I kind of think the thread color and the pattern are competing with this busy print. I don't think it looks bad, but I don't think it's great. But the client really liked it. So that's all I need to hear. It was well worth all that effort. And I love doing this leaf. It's so much fun. And this is one where I definitely want to start with the stem in the middle, and then quilt the outside of it. The parameters are definitely set. I don't have to worry about where they're going to go. The seam line between the block and the sashing are the parameters. So what I like to do on large triangles is make a partial, so it looks like a larger one is on top of this, well, not smaller one, but where one is on top of the other one. So whichever one is on top, I quilt that one first and then nestle this one in. And what's good practice at the beginning of your leaf quilting experience is to go get some actual leaves and trace them, outline them with your finger, see exactly how leaves really are. especially with oak or maple or, leaves that look like that. They do things you wouldn't think they could be able to do. All the deep wells and the curves. You could make the leaf rounded. You could make them pointy. You could do a combination of either one. I don't think there's a way to mess these up. They're so forgiving. And this is the corner block, which is smaller. So here I've opted just to do one large leaf. And it's a directional quilt, as I say. So I've got the leaves arranged so it looks like they're pointing kind of up. But you could have them go in any direction. It doesn't really matter. And they're just good looking all over the place. You could chain them together in a border. You'd probably need this probably isn't the best design for sashing because you need some space. But see how fast it is? And they're fun. And I can just do this all day long. I think they look great. What do you think? Was this the right thread color? Was this the right design? That's going to be a matter of opinion. Okay, on to the background of the tree block. I left this for last because I didn't know what I was going to do in there. Every idea I could think of was complex and would take a long time. So I looked at a whole bunch of designs online and I ended up with this combination. It's continuous curve. That's what gets us from one part of the background to the other. This part here is a swirl with some leaves. So it starts off as continuous curve and a leaf in the corner, more continuous curve, a swirl, some little leaves around it. Here's another leaf in the corner, more continuous curve to get from one patch to the other. And now we're back to continuous curve with the swirl and some simple leaves. It's easy to get mixed up and do things in the wrong order, so it pays to stop and regroup and think, wait a minute, where am I going next? So this is really sparse. I don't excel at coming up with ideas like this. This is just not my forte. But I think it looks really good and charming for so little quilting. And the client was really happy with it. There is the whole tree block. Here's a look at the back of the quilt. This fabric doesn't show off the quilting like a solid fabric would, but you can still see it. This quilt will be hanging up on a wall most of the time. And here's a look at the finished product. So aiming for a simple, expedient design scheme did not leave me much room to do the high contrast of straight lines anywhere, but I still think I got some good contrast in here with all these curves. And I think that's okay because the quilt is pretty angular and pointy. So that is fine. Look at all the dimension happening in here. The batting was one layer of Hobbs 80-20. which has a really nice puff to it, which is why we all love it so much. I think there's certainly enough quilting in here. It does not look unquilted. It does not look too sparse, but it's not densely quilted. What a deep, dark, delicious, and gorgeous quilt. We loved it. I hope you've enjoyed seeing it come together. It was a joy to do. It was a lot of fun. Thanks.